I think he's preparing them for a potential of more mobilization, of a long war in Ukraine, if not intensive in one sense, but being prepared, saying to people, be prepared. This could be a long war. Survival is at stake. Talking about the Donbass, in a way, I was surprised he didn't mention Crimea actually, but he did mention defending Donbass, and preparing them for casualties if the Ukrainians conduct a strong and maybe successful counteroffensive. I think the first thing to say is to stress how important this parade is within Russia and the message that it sends out on a continuous basis, really, although it's 70 years ago plus for the World War II. The Russians, of course, suffered enormous casualties, and they look back on that period with huge pride, but also a huge conviction that they will never have to go through that again. And we can easily overlook that, from a Western perspective. So that victory parade is very important psychologically. It wasn't surprising that it was downgraded a bit because they are obviously concerned about security threat and so forth, and they've got a lot of people deployed down in the Ukraine. So, in that sense, I wasn't surprised. But actually, the parade is normally led by a T-34. Actually, one of the major World War II tanks. So, in one sense, that wasn't surprising to see that on parade. But there were much reduced numbers of other vehicles. I think there are about 50 odd vehicles on parade compared to well over 130 last year and 100 and nearly 200 the year before that, and only around 8,000 soldiers on parade, soldiers, sailors, and airmen. But again, there have been 20, I think probably 11, certainly well over 11,000 last year. So it was much reduced. But nonetheless, I was impressed in one sense that they were prepared to go ahead with it and to put that number of people out there.
Yeah, that's really interesting context, Tim. And the speech from Vladimir Putin, it was in many ways just familiar fare, wasn't it? Railing about the West, the woke West waging real war against Russia. I mean, we can only speculate on whether that shtick is wearing thin with a lot of Russians.
I don't think it's wearing thin with the Russians. I think it's and your point is the major point you just made. Actually, is that the audience for this is an internal audience. I mean, clearly there's a message to the West as well, which we listen to and will interpret. But my sense is that this is a message internally to the Russian people to say that Russia is under threat, and he's emphasizing that. And obviously, from our perspective, overplaying it and actually, in some respects, completely lying. But I think he's preparing them for a potential of more mobilization, of a long war in Ukraine, if not intensive in one sense, but being prepared, saying to people, be prepared. This could be a long war. Survival is at stake. Talking about the Donbass, in a way, I was surprised he didn't mention Crimea actually, but he did mention defending Donbass, and preparing them for casualties if the Ukrainians conduct a strong and maybe successful counteroffensive. Yeah. And if that counteroffensive goes well, preparing them for what he might decide to do, to play back against it. So that internal message, I think, is a really important message for them. Yeah. Now, again, you're right. We can see that and in a sense, yawn and say that, well, we heard all this before. But I don't underestimate the impact it has, I think it makes internally.
Right. Now a battlefield point, because it's now reported the UK is leading a group of European countries asking for expressions of interest from industry to supply Ukraine with long-range missiles. We're talking about missiles with a range of up to 300 kilometres. That's a big increase, or would be, in capacity. Now, no final decisions have taken, but it's interesting that move has happened, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And of course, President Zelensky met with Ursula von der Leyen today and pressed the point about ammunition, fighter jets, increasing numbers of equipments that are needed. And this long-range missile issue is a part of that. Now, the West has been pretty reluctant to give Ukraine the ability to strike deep inside Russia. And these drone attacks in Moscow, the attacks on the oil storage in Sevastopol and so forth, were things that I think a year ago, or less than a year ago probably, but we would have been reluctant to see Ukraine doing because of the fear of expanding the dimensions and the reach of this war. So giving them long-range missiles gives them the ability to reach deeper into Russia, and by reaching deeper into Russia, it winds Putin up even further. Yeah. Now, as you say, this hasn't yet been agreed, and it will be interesting to see whether any of the NATO nations or indeed others are prepared to provide that sort of equipment within the constraints or within the the necessary technical requirements that the UK is asking for. But it is an expansion, I think, again of the ability to allow Ukraine to conduct more offensive operations.
Yeah, and while you talk about getting up Putin's nose, he'd have been irked by the sight of Ursula von der Leyen in Kyiv talking about European integration, about sanctions, and so on. Even though I suppose the thing that he would hate and fear most is any idea of NATO membership for Ukraine at some point in the future.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, her visit, is interesting in the sense that it's not surprising. I mean, it's a good thing that she's gone, representing the EU. But I have to say the EU is in a difficult position here. At the same time as this has been happening, there have been other issues going on in the EU, particularly over the state of their economies, and particularly again over the size of their debt levels. So there's been talk within the EU having to cut back on spending, on reducing debt levels. And I think countries like Germany and the Netherlands in particular, the usual players in this who argue that the EU has to be financially stable, that they're saying that the EU as a whole must reduce its debt levels to under 3%, which was a figure at Maastricht, actually, if you go back far enough. And many of the EU members are way above that. And at the same time, they've all agreed that they should be putting up their defense spending to 2% of GDP. Now, some of them are spending less than 1%. So you've got this real tension emerging, which is we want EU to spend less to get its debt sorted out, to get its economy sorted out. But at the same time, we want them to be spending more on defense. And, holding that tension is not going to be easy.
Yes.
So
yes.
Like a lot of the EU statements and a lot of the, obviously politicking, but one's got to be careful about assuming too much that will emerge positively from it.
Well, indeed, it's a long.
The EU has provided
time.
quite good support, but has been lacking in quite a lot over this last year, in my view.
Yeah, it's some way down the line. And we've spoken about Evgeny Prigozhin before, the boss of the Wagner private army, and he's now saying he was warned by Moscow that he'd be seen as a traitor if he and his Wagner withdrew from Bakhmut. Now we know he's been putting pressure on to get more ammunition out of the Russian military machine, but it does tell a tale of such bad blood inside that machine.
It certainly does. It has been extraordinary, actually. I mean, over the last few weeks, if not months, there's been a constant batting of insults, oblique comment, between him and the Wagner Group as a whole, and Moscow and Putin. I mean, they're supposed to have been obviously great friends and allies in all of this, but I think that the Wagner Group is taking serious casualties. There's no doubt about that, and they've been unable to secure these big cities because, not surprisingly, actually, I can remember discussions we had some time ago. Fighting in these big cities is really, really tough business. You're fighting house to house. You need huge numbers of people, huge numbers of weapons and ammunition to fight your way through, and you take serious casualties. And he clearly thinks that he is not getting enough support from Moscow. And this idea that he would be a traitor if he withdrew his forces from the city is, in a way, is bizarre, actually. And it shows that Putin, like in so many other areas, is pretty close to losing the plot, but also division within those areas is not helpful from a Russian perspective.